The wind blew hard through the mountain valley, bringing the sharp smell of wet dirt and early snow. Hazel stood in the freezing mud, her thin wool coat completely soaked through, and her pockets holding nothing but small pieces of string. She had reached the end of her choices and her money. The heavy doors of the local boarding house swung shut, locking her out in the bitter cold as darkness fell over the small town of Pine Ridge. That was when a large wagon stopped in the middle of the road. The driver did not offer a warm greeting or a soft smile. He simply looked down at her shaking shoulders, watched the sleet hit the wooden seat, and spoke in a low, even voice. He told her to get into the back if she wanted to eat dinner, noting that the thick mud of the valley had already ruined her boots completely. Hazel moved her weight from one foot to the other, feeling the freezing water soak through the cracked leather of her left shoe. It was a sharp, biting cold that moved up from her ankles and settled deep into her legs. She pulled her old woolen shawl tighter around her neck, but the fabric was worn thin, smelling of wet wool and long days of travel. Across the narrow street, the blacksmith locked his heavy wooden door with a loud sound. The slide of the iron bolt sounded clear and final in the fading gray light. Hazel stared at the dark window as the last lamp inside went out. She was entirely alone in the town. She pressed her back against the rough wood of the empty land office, which offered a small shield against the freezing gale coming down from the high peaks. She pressed her fingernails into her hands to keep from crying, knowing that tears would only waste the little energy she had left. It had been 2 days since the stagecoach left her behind in this mountain outpost. It had been 2 days since she discovered that the small leather pouch tucked inside her dress had been cut open and emptied by a person she had trusted at the previous station. A thin dog walked past her in the street, its ribs showing clearly through its gray fur. The animal did not even pause to look at her, knowing there was nothing to get from a person standing still in the freezing rain. Down the wooden sidewalk, heavy footsteps sounded against the planks with a slow, steady rhythm. Hazel pulled back into the deep shadows of the wall. In a remote place like this, a woman alone in the dark had to be careful. She slipped her right hand deep into her coat pocket, wrapping her cold fingers around the metal handle of a small letter opener she had kept. It was not a real weapon, but holding the cold metal gave her a small bit of comfort. The person stepped off the wooden walkway and into the thick mud of the road. He was a very tall man, his shape distinct against the dark background of the pine trees that grew along the edge of the town. He wore a thick black coat that looked heavy enough to stop the wind completely. A dark hat was pulled low over his forehead, hiding his face from the falling sleet. He did not look toward the shadows where she stood. Instead, he lifted a 60-pound sack of grain from the ground and placed it into the back of a large wooden wagon pulled by 2 dark horses. The horses stamped their hooves, their breath rising like white smoke in the cold air. The man threw the heavy bag over the wooden side, and it landed with a dull thud against the floorboards. Hazel shivered again, a sudden movement that made her teeth click together in the quiet night. The man stopped working immediately and turned his head toward her. Hazel held her breath, keeping her hand tight around the metal tool in her pocket. When he lifted his hat slightly, she saw his face clearly under the faint light of the town lamp. He had stark white hair that contrasted sharply with the dark night, and his skin was completely pale, almost like the snow that was beginning to fall around them. He did not look, nor did he look especially soft. His expression was entirely calm and still. He reached into the back of the wagon, pulled a heavy canvas cloth over his supplies, and tied it down with long, steady movements. The thick rope made a rough sound against the iron hooks of the wagon bed. He remarked that every place in town was closed for the night, his voice sounding quiet and deep. "I know," Hazel said, her voice sounding small and thin in the cold air. She could not use the polite, confident tone she usually relied on when speaking to strangers. The white-haired man finished tying the knot on the canvas. He did not climb up to the driver's seat right away. He stood in the deep mud, letting the wet snow collect on the brim of his hat. He looked down at her ruined shoes, the thick mud on the hem of her long skirt, and the way her arms were wrapped tightly against the cold. He did not ask her for her name, where she had come from, or why she was standing by herself outside an empty building during a winter storm. He simply told her that she would freeze if she stayed against that wall. "I can manage," Hazel replied, her jaw tight as she tried to control her shivering. The pale man made a small sound that might have been a laugh if there had been any humor in it. He walked around to the front of the wagon to check the leather straps on the horses. He told her to do as she pleased. A sudden wave of fear hit Hazel as she realized he was getting ready to leave. He was the last person on the street, and if he drove away into the mountains, she would be left alone in the dark town with no shelter. The thought was simple and clear. She took a step forward, her boot making a loud sound as it broke free from the thick mud. She called out for him to wait. The man paused with his hand on the leather reins, looking back over his shoulder at her. Hazel felt her throat tighten, and the words were difficult to say. She admitted that she had no place to go for the night. The wind grew stronger, throwing small pieces of ice against her cold face. The man watched her for a long moment without moving. His gaze was steady and careful, like someone evaluating a situation. Then he dropped the reins and walked back to the rear of the wagon. He unhooked the wooden tailgate, letting it drop open with a loud noise. He told her to come with him and eat dinner, speaking not as an invitation, but as a plain fact. Hazel looked at the open wagon, thought of the cold night, and walked forward into the dark. The wagon ride up the mountain trail was a slow and rough journey. The wooden vehicle did not have springs, and every stone and hole in the frozen road sent a sharp jolt through Hazel's back. She sat in the corner of the wagon bed, wedged securely between a wooden crate of tools and a large sack of grain. The white-haired man had thrown her a thick woolen blanket before climbing onto the high front seat. The blanket smelled faintly of wood smoke and cedar, but she wrapped it tightly around her shoulders like a shield against the wind. She kept her eyes fixed on the broad back of the driver. He sat perfectly still, his shoulders straight against the driving snow, occasionally moving the reins to guide the horses through the dark woods. They climbed higher into the hills, and the air became noticeably colder. The tall pine trees pressed close to the edges of the narrow trail, their branches heavy with white snow that scraped against the side of the wagon with a dry sound. Hazel's initial relief began to change into a quiet nervousness as they moved further from the town. She was entirely dependent on this stranger now. He could stop the horses at any point, and nobody in Pine Ridge would ever know where she had gone. Her fingers remained inside her coat pocket, holding the small letter opener tightly until her hand felt stiff. She asked him who he was, but the loud wind carried her words away into the trees before they could reach the front of the wagon. A moment later, the man spoke without turning his head to look at her. He told her his name was Cade. Hazel offered her own name in return, her voice shaking slightly from the constant movement of the wagon. He did not make a reply, and they continued the journey in total silence for another hour. The freezing rain turned into large, heavy flakes of snow that covered the dirt road and made the horses' footsteps completely quiet. The darkness around them was deep, broken only by a small lantern hanging from the side of the wagon that cast long shadows across the white ground. Hazel's feet had gone completely numb inside her wet shoes, and she tried to move her toes but could not feel them at all. "Are we getting close?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Cade replied that the horses knew the way to the shelter. 10 minutes later, the thick trees opened into a small clearing on the side of the hill. Through the falling snow, Hazel saw the dark shape of a small log house. It was built simply from heavy timber, with a stone chimney that showed a small ribbon of gray smoke against the dark sky. Cade pulled back on the leather reins, bringing the horses to a stop. He climbed down from the seat, his boots breaking through the fresh snow with a loud crunch. He walked to the back of the wagon and lowered the wooden tailgate, telling her to step down. Hazel attempted to stand, but her legs were completely stiff from the cold and the long ride. Her knees gave way immediately when she tried to put her weight on the wooden floorboards. She caught the side of the wagon to keep from falling, letting out a small breath as her cold muscles hurt. Cade gave a short sigh, stepped closer, and placed his large hands around her waist. His grip was firm and steady, lifting her out of the wagon as easily as if she were a small bundle of wood. When he set her on the snowy ground, her feet failed her again. Before she could fall into the snow, Cade caught her by the arm, his grip holding her upright instantly. He remarked that her feet were not working properly, looking down at her shoes. Without another word, he lifted her into his arms, placing one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her shoulders. Hazel caught her breath, instinctively putting her arms around his neck to steady herself. His coat felt cold, and she noticed that his skin did not seem to have the usual warmth of a person. But he carried her easily up the 3 wooden steps of the porch. He pushed the heavy front door open with his boot and took her inside the dark cabin. The air inside was still, smelling of old wood and cold ash. Cade set her down carefully in a large wooden rocking chair near the stone fireplace. "Take off those shoes," he told her, striking a small match against the stones of the hearth. Hazel tried to work the frozen laces of her boots, but her fingers were too cold to move properly. She watched him touch the match to a pile of dry wood that had been prepared in the fireplace. A small yellow flame caught the dry bark and began to grow, spreading a warm light across the room. Cade turned around, saw her struggling with the wet leather knots, and knelt on the floor in front of her. He moved her hands aside and untied the wet laces with quick, practiced movements, removing the ruined shoes and her wet stockings without any hesitation. He told her not to put her feet too close to the open fire right away, warning her that warming up too fast would cause a sharp pain. He stood up and threw the wet boots toward the corner near the door. He walked over to a heavy wooden table in the center of the room and lit a small oil lamp. The yellow light showed the inside of the cabin, which was kept very clean and simple. There was an iron stove in the corner, several shelves holding glass jars of food, and a single narrow bed against the far wall covered in a thick dark blanket. Hazel wrapped her arms around her knees, keeping her bare feet away from the direct heat of the growing fire, while Cade picked up an iron pan from the wall. The sound of thick meat hitting the hot iron pan filled the quiet room. It made a loud sizzling sound, sending a few small drops of fat into the fire and making the flames flash bright orange for a second. Hazel sat perfectly still in the wooden chair, watching the stranger move around the kitchen area. As her feet began to warm up, a sharp ache replaced the numbness, making her press her teeth together to keep from making a sound. Cade moved with a quiet efficiency, never wasting a movement as he prepared the food. He sliced a small onion with a long knife and added the pieces to the pan. The rich smell of the food hit Hazel immediately, making her stomach tighten with hunger. She had not eaten anything substantial in nearly 2 days, and the smell of the cooking meat was almost overwhelming. Cade reached into a wooden box, pulled out a handful of dried biscuits, and placed them on a tin plate near the edge of the stove to warm through. Hazel watched him closely from her chair, looking for any sign of what he expected from her. In her experience, people always wanted something in exchange for help. Her family had expected her to marry for money, and the people she had met in the towns always looked at her with an eye for profit. Cade did not look at her at all. He kept his eyes on the frying pan. After several minutes, he lifted the heavy pan off the heat using an old piece of cloth. He took 2 simple tin plates from the shelf, placed a warm biscuit on each, and divided the meat and onions between them. He walked across the room and handed one of the plates to her, along with a small fork. The heat from the tin plate felt warm against her hands, but she held it tightly. The food was simple and heavy, but it smelled excellent. Cade took his own plate, sat down on a smooth wooden stool on the other side of the fireplace, and began to eat without saying anything. He did not ask if she liked the meal. Hazel tried to eat slowly at first, picking up a small piece of meat with her fork. The warm food tasted rich and salty against her tongue, and her self-control disappeared completely. She forgot her old lessons about manners and proper behavior, eating the food quickly and clearing the plate in a matter of minutes. She even used a small piece of the biscuit to clean the remaining fat from the tin until the plate was completely spotless. When she finished, she leaned back in the chair, her breath coming a bit fast as the warm food settled in her stomach. She looked up and saw Cade watching her with his pale eyes, his own plate only half finished. Hazel felt her face grow warm with embarrassment. She lowered her eyes and wiped her mouth with her wrist, realizing she had eaten like a starving animal. She murmured an apology, explaining that she had been very hungry. Cade looked back down at his plate and took another bite, saying quietly that there was nothing wrong with being hungry when a person needed food. The silence returned to the cabin, heavy and quiet, broken only by the sound of the wind pushing the snow against the small window panes. Hazel set her empty plate on the floorboards next to her chair. The warmth of the fire and the heavy food made her feel incredibly tired, the exhaustion of the past 2 days finally catching up to her. She looked over at the single narrow bed in the corner of the room, then looked back at the white-haired man sitting across from her. She asked him where she was supposed to sleep, her voice tight as she waited for the price of his assistance to be named. Cade stood up from his stool, walked over to a large wooden chest at the end of the bed, and opened the heavy lid. He pulled out a large, heavy quilt made from different pieces of thick cloth. He walked over and dropped the heavy blanket into her lap. He pointed toward the floor near the hearth, telling her she could use the chair or the floorboards, noting that the floor was harder but stayed warmer through the night. Hazel blinked in surprise, asking him where he would sleep. He stated clearly that he would use his own bed. He walked over to the front door, checked the heavy iron bolt to ensure it was locked against the storm, and then blew out the oil lamp. The room became dark, lit only by the red glow of the dying fire. Hazel heard the sound of his boots hitting the floor, the creak of the bed as he lay down, and then the steady sound of his breathing from the far side of the room. He had not come near her, nor had he asked her for anything at all. For the first time since she had fled her old life, a single tear ran down Hazel's cheek in the dark. She pulled the heavy quilt completely over her shoulders, curled her legs up in the large wooden chair, and let herself cry quietly. It was not because she was frightened, but because she realized that for this one night, she was completely safe from the world outside. The morning did not bring a bright sun. Instead, a flat white light filled the frosted windows of the cabin, showing that the storm was still moving through the mountains. Hazel woke up with a sharp movement, her neck feeling stiff from sleeping at an awkward angle against the hard wood of the rocking chair. For a few seconds, she could not remember where she was until she smelled the sharp scent of hot coffee and old leather. The dull ache in her feet reminded her of the muddy road in Pine Ridge. She opened her eyes and saw that the room was very cold, the fire having burned down to small red pieces during the night. Cade was already awake and sitting at the long wooden table with his back turned toward her. He was holding a flat stone, moving it in slow, steady circles over the metal blade of a small hand axe. The regular scraping sound filled the quiet room. Hazel moved her legs, her joints making a small clicking sound. She pulled the heavy quilt closer around her shoulders, shivering as the cold morning air hit her skin. Cade did not turn his head to look at her, but he spoke in his low voice, telling her that the coffee was ready on the top of the stove. Hazel stood up slowly, her feet hurting as she put her weight on the cold floorboards. The skin was swollen and a dark color from the cold. She walked carefully over to the iron stove, picked up a blue metal pot, and poured some of the dark coffee into a tin mug. The liquid was black and bitter, but it felt warm as she drank it, sending a line of heat down to her stomach. She stood by the stove, holding the hot mug with both hands to warm her fingers. She looked down at her clothes. Her long dress was completely ruined, caked in dry gray mud along the hem and smelling of wet wool. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and she felt a sudden wave of shame at her appearance. In her former life in the city, she would never have allowed anyone to see her looking so untidy. She had been taught to keep herself perfectly neat at all times, right up until her family lost everything and she had to run away. Now she was standing in a stranger's cabin, wearing dirty clothes and drinking bitter coffee. She needed to use the washroom, but the thought of asking this pale, silent man where to go made her feel very uncomfortable. Cade stopped moving the sharpening stone across the metal blade. He pointed the wooden handle of the axe toward a heavy canvas cloth that hung across the back corner of the room near the bed. He told her there was a wash bucket behind the curtain, warning her not to go outside because the wind was growing stronger and a person could easily lose their way in the snow. Hazel walked carefully across the floor, pulled the thick cloth aside, and took care of her business in complete silence. She hoped the sound of the wind outside was loud enough to cover any noise. When she came out from behind the curtain, she felt completely exhausted again. Cade had not moved from his place at the table. He was testing the sharp edge of the axe blade with his thumb. Hazel walked back toward the iron stove, wanting to make herself useful so he would not think she was completely helpless. She reached out to pick up the heavy iron pan he had used the night before, intending to clean it. Her fingers were still stiff from the cold, and her grip slipped. The heavy pan fell onto the floorboards with a loud metallic clang. Hazel jumped back, her heart beating fast with sudden fear. She dropped to her knees immediately to pick up the handle, apologizing quickly and explaining that she was only trying to help clean the kitchen area. Cade stood up from the table, his chair making a loud sound against the floorboards. He walked over to where she was kneeling, his large frame blocking the light from the window. He did not look angry, but his face was completely serious. He reached down, took her by the arm, and pulled her up to her feet without any effort at all. He looked at her hands, remarking that her skin was too soft and cold to handle heavy iron without getting hurt. He told her to sit back down in the chair. He did not wait for her to say anything. He picked up the pan himself, took a piece of cloth, and began to clean the iron with quick movements. Hazel went back to the rocking chair, holding her tin mug tightly. He had not shouted at her or raised his hand, but his words made her feel completely useless. She sat in the chair as the wind grew louder outside, knowing she had no skills for this kind of life. By the middle of the day, the winter storm became much worse. The wind hit the sides of the log house with a loud howling sound, making the heavy timber walls shake against the force. The sky outside the frosted windows turned a dark gray color, and the snow blew sideways across the clearing, blocking out the light until the glass was covered in a thick layer of white ice. The small cabin felt very small now, like a wooden box shut tight against the world. Hazel walked back and forth across the room, taking 2 steps from the fireplace to the table and 2 steps back to keep herself moving. Cade sat on the floor near the iron stove, working on a broken piece of leather harness. He used a sharp metal tool and thick thread, pulling each stitch tight with steady movements. He had been working on the leather for 2 hours, without saying a word to her. The complete silence in the room was making Hazel feel extremely nervous. She was accustomed to the constant noise of the city, the sound of carriages, the talk of people in the streets, and the loud arguments of the man she had left behind. To her, a long silence usually meant something bad was about to happen. She stopped walking and asked him loudly if he ever talked at all, the words coming out before she could stop them. Cade did not look up from his work. He punched another hole through the thick leather strap. He replied simply that he spoke when there was something that needed to be said, and right now, nothing required words. Hazel let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded a bit wild in the quiet room. She remarked that they were trapped together in a small cabin while a terrible storm moved outside, and he was acting as if nothing unusual were happening at all. Cade pulled the thick thread through the leather and looked up at her. He stated flatly that it was simply winter in the mountains, which happened every year. Hazel pressed her hands into fists at her sides, her voice rising, as she told him she was losing her mind. She complained about the ice on the windows, the smell of grease in the air, and the pain in her cold feet. Cade laid the leather harness down on his knees and looked at her carefully with his pale, unblinking eyes. He noted that she was still alive, reminding her that the day before she was freezing against a wall, and now she was warm enough to complain about her surroundings. The plain truth of his words made her anger disappear instantly, leaving her feeling deeply ashamed. She swayed slightly as she stood, the sudden change in her feelings making her head feel light. Cade gave a short sigh, rose to his feet, and walked over to the wooden chest near his bed. He searched inside for a moment and pulled out a large, clean flannel shirt of a dark red color. He walked back and threw the shirt into her lap, telling her to take off her wet dress and hang it near the fire to dry before the dampness made her sick. Hazel looked at the large shirt, then at his broad back as he turned away to work on the fire with an iron rod. She hesitated, asking him if he expected her to change her clothes right there. He did not turn around. He told her he was not looking at her and repeated that she needed to get out of the damp wool. Hazel moved into the dark corner behind the rocking chair. With shaking fingers, she began to undo the small buttons down the front of her dress, the fabric feeling stiff and heavy from the mud. It took her several minutes to get the dress off her shoulders. She was left in her thin cotton underclothes, which felt cold against her skin. Shivering, she pulled the large red shirt over her head. It was much too big for her, the hem reaching down to her knees and the long sleeves covering her hands completely. The fabric felt rough but very warm. She rolled the sleeves up quickly and picked up her wet dress, draping it carefully over the back of the rocking chair near the heat of the fire. When she turned back toward the room, she saw that Cade was looking at her face. He asked her if she felt better now. Hazel pulled the collar of the warm shirt closer to her neck, feeling very small but strangely safe. The fabric smelled of cedar wood and clean air. She looked down at the floorboards and whispered that she did feel better, thanking him for the clothing. Cade gave a single, short nod of his head, sat back down on the floor with his leather tools, and went back to his work. The silence returned to the small cabin, but it did not feel dangerous anymore. It was just the quiet of the room. The light outside disappeared early in the afternoon, swallowed completely by the thick storm. Cade lit the small oil lamp on the table, casting long shadows across the log walls of the room. The temperature inside the cabin began to fall as the freezing air found small cracks in the wooden walls. Hazel sat close to the iron stove, pulling her knees up against her chest under the large red shirt. She watched the white-haired man work. He had finished the leather harness and was now cleaning a long rifle, using a soft cloth and a small tin of dark oil. He moved with the same steady, slow rhythm he used for everything. He took the metal pieces apart, wiped them clean, and put them back together without any hurry. Hazel looked at his hands. They were large and pale, with thick fingers and a long, white scar running up his left arm until it disappeared under his sleeve. The mark did not look like it came from a tool or a knife. It looked rough and uneven. Cade noticed her looking at his arm, but he did not cover the skin. He simply kept wiping the long metal barrel of the gun. He stated quietly that a wild animal had caused the mark 5 years ago in the upper woods when he was working. Hazel looked from the scar up to his pale face, asking him if he had killed the animal. Cade made a low sound in his throat, explaining that the creature had hurt him badly and left him in the snow for several hours before he could get back to his horses. He looked down at the rifle, remarking that the animal kept its territory and he kept the mark, which he considered a fair arrangement. He told the story with a completely calm voice, as if he were speaking about an ordinary chore. Hazel pulled her arms tighter around her legs, asking him why he chose to stay in such a dangerous, lonely place instead of moving to a town that was safer. Cade looked over at her, the yellow lamplight reflecting in his pale eyes. He stated that the towns were full of people, and in his experience, people could be more difficult than wild animals because animals only wanted food, while people always wanted to control another person's life. The words felt very heavy to Hazel, hitting her right where her old memories lived. She looked away from his gaze, staring into the red coals of the stove. In the glowing heat, she seemed to see the face of Thomas, the man her family had chosen for her. She remembered his expensive clothes, his cold smile, and the tight grip of his fingers on her arm when she told him she would not give him the last of her father's land papers. She raised her hand automatically, her fingers touching the side of her neck where the skin still felt tender. Cade watched her hand move to her throat. He saw the expression on her face, recognizing the look of someone who had been cornered by a predator. He did not ask her any questions about it. Instead, he stood up from the table, set the long rifle down, and walked to the corner of the room. He picked up a large metal wash tub and dragged it across the floorboards, setting it down directly in front of the open fireplace with a loud scraping sound. Hazel started out of her thoughts, her heart beating fast as she asked him what he was doing. Cade went to the stove, took 2 heavy pots of boiling water, and poured them into the metal tub, creating a thick cloud of white steam in the room. He added some cold water from the bucket near the door to make the temperature right. He walked over to a shelf, took down a clean towel and a square piece of soap, and set them on the edge of the tub. He told her the water was ready for her to wash, noting that she needed to clean up after her long journey in the mud. Hazel looked at the steaming water, which felt like an impossible luxury in the middle of a winter storm. But the tub was sitting in the very center of the single room. She told him she could not take a bath with him standing right there in the cabin. Cade did not show any annoyance, but he picked up his heavy black coat and his dark hat from the wooden peg near the door. He put his arms into the sleeves, and Hazel asked him where he was going in the middle of the storm. He replied that he had wood to stack in the side shed, telling her to take her time and to call out when she was finished and dressed. He pulled his hat low, unbolted the heavy front door, and stepped out into the white storm. A blast of freezing air rushed into the cabin, moving the smoke from the fireplace before the heavy door slammed shut and the lock clicked from the outside. Hazel was left completely alone in the warm room with the steaming water. Hazel stood up from the rocking chair, her legs still feeling a bit weak as she walked over to the metal tub. The white steam rose up in warm clouds, feeling wonderful against her cold face. She took off the large red shirt and her remaining thin underclothes, stepping into the hot water with a small sigh. The heat was very strong, almost painful at first, but as she sat down, the warmth began to move deep into her tired muscles, taking away the cold that had stayed in her body since her arrival in Pine Ridge. Without her thick winter clothes, she looked very thin, her ribs showing clearly under her pale skin. There were dark bruises on her arms from the rough ride in the stagecoach, and a distinct mark remained on her collarbone where Thomas had held her tight before she escaped. She took the rough piece of soap and began to wash her skin thoroughly, scrubbing away the gray dirt from the road and the dried mud from her legs. She leaned her head back, letting her long dark hair sink into the warm water until it was completely clean. When the water began to grow cool, she stood up, shivering as the cold air of the room hit her wet skin. She took the rough towel and dried herself quickly, her teeth clicking together in the cold. She put her thin underclothes back on and pulled Cade's large red shirt over her head once more. She used the towel to dry her long hair as best she could, leaving the dark strands hanging over her shoulders. She walked over to the front door, looking at the thick wood before knocking loudly against the timber. She called out that she was finished with her bath. A few seconds later, the iron bolt moved and the heavy door pushed open, bringing a large pile of snow into the entryway along with a rush of freezing air. Cade stepped inside, his black coat covered in a white layer of ice and frost clinging to his white hair and eyebrows. He looked completely unaffected by the extreme cold outside. He pushed the door shut against the wind, slid the iron lock into place, and took off his heavy coat, hanging it back on the wooden peg. He did not look directly at her body. He walked over to the metal tub, took the handles in his hands, and dragged the heavy water across the floorboards. He opened the door a small amount, poured the used water out into the deep snow, and shut the door tight again. He walked over to the fireplace, holding his large hands near the flames to warm them, remarking simply that the wood was now stacked for the night. He told her to go to the bed and get some rest. Hazel walked over to the narrow cot in the corner, pulling the thick, dark blanket up to her chin as she lay down. The storm did not stop during the night. It continued to blow against the log cabin with a steady, heavy sound. By the next morning, Hazel felt a deep ache returning to her back and arms, her skin feeling very hot and dry to the touch. She stayed under the heavy blanket, her body shaking with a sudden chill, even though the room was warm from the stove. Cade was sitting at the table, working on his boots with a small rag and a tin of grease. Hazel tried to keep her breathing steady, but a sharp cough broke from her throat, sounding loud in the quiet room. Cade stopped his hand immediately. He set the tin of grease down on the wooden table, wiped his fingers on the cloth, and walked over to the side of the cot. He did not ask her how she felt. He simply reached out and pressed the back of his hand against her forehead. His skin felt remarkably cold against her hot forehead, like a piece of river ice. He stated quietly that she had a strong fever in her blood. Hazel tried to say she was fine, but her voice sounded very weak and dry. Cade ignored her words, walked over to the wooden shelves, and took down a small glass jar containing pieces of dried tree bark. He placed a handful of the bark into a tin cup and poured boiling water over it, from the kettle on the stove. He brought the cup over to the bed, lifted her head slightly, and told her to drink the mixture. The liquid tasted extremely bitter, making Hazel pull her head back, but Cade held the tin cup steady against her lip until she swallowed the entire drink. He told her the bark would help bring the heat down from her head. For the rest of the day and through the night, Hazel remained in the bed, caught in a strange dream where she could not tell what was real. She dreamed of the long road, the cold mud of the valley, and the angry face of Thomas looking for her in the dark. She moved around under the heavy blankets, trying to escape the heat. At some point during the night, she felt a cold cloth pressed gently against her face and neck. She opened her eyes slightly and saw Cade sitting on a wooden box next to the bed. He had a bowl of cold water in his lap, and he was using a cloth to cool her skin. As he moved the cloth near her shoulder, the collar of the large shirt moved aside, showing the dark marks on her collarbone clearly in the red light of the fire. Cade's hand stopped moving completely, his pale eyes fixing on the bruised skin for a long moment. His jaw went tight, and he remained perfectly still in the dark room. Hazel felt a sudden wave of fear, pulling the heavy blanket up to her neck with a quick movement. Cade did not ask her who had hurt her, nor did he say anything about the marks. He simply rinsed the cloth in the cold water, folded it carefully, and laid it across her forehead, telling her in a low voice that the fever was beginning to break, and she should go back to sleep. He sat by the bed for the rest of the night, holding his long rifle across his knees. The next morning, the loud sound of the wind had stopped completely, leaving a deep quiet in the hills. Hazel opened her eyes and saw a bright white light coming through the windows, showing that the sun was finally shining on the deep snow outside. Her head still felt a bit heavy, but the burning heat of the fever was gone from her skin. She looked over and saw Cade working near the iron stove, the smell of cooking meat filling the small cabin. He walked over and handed her a plate with food, telling her she needed to eat to regain her strength. Hazel took the plate, eating the warm food slowly, while Cade sat on his wooden stool near the fireplace. The bright morning light showed the lines of tiredness around his eyes. He had not slept at all while she was sick. Hazel set her empty plate down on the floorboards, looked at the white-haired man, and began to speak quietly. She told him that the man who had hurt her was named Thomas, explaining how her family had owed him a large amount of money after their business failed in the city. She explained that Thomas had offered to forget the debt if she agreed to become his wife, but she soon discovered that he was a cruel person who wanted to treat her like property. She told Cade how she had taken a small amount of money from his desk while he was asleep, and caught the first carriage moving into the mountains, not caring where the road went as long as it was far away from him. Cade listened to her story without moving, his pale face remaining completely still as she spoke. He lit a small rolled cigarette, blew a stream of gray smoke toward the wooden rafters, and stated that a person who used their strength to hurt someone else was only showing their own fear. He asked her if she thought Thomas would send people to look for her in the mountains. Hazel admitted she did not know, noting that he had enough money to hire men for that kind of work. Cade looked out the window at the deep snow, remarking that the mountain roads would be completely blocked until the spring. He told her that nobody could move through 10 feet of snow in the high canyon, and if anyone tried to come up the trail in the spring, they would have to pass his cabin first. He looked at her with his pale eyes, stating clearly that nobody would come up that hill unless he allowed it, telling her she was safe in his home. He did not make any grand promises. He simply stated the facts of the mountain, and his words gave Hazel a deep sense of comfort she had not felt in a long time. The snow began to melt over the next 3 days as the sun shone warmly on the high valley. The sound of water running off the wooden roof and moving through the small creek behind the house filled the quiet air. Hazel felt her strength coming back to her body completely. She began to help around the cabin, learning how to manage the fire in the iron stove and how to prepare the simple meals from the supplies on the shelves. Cade did not interfere with her work. He spent his days cutting wood and checking his animal traps in the hills. They lived together in a quiet routine, moving around the small room without any trouble. The long silences between them did not feel uncomfortable anymore. They had become a simple way of sharing the space. But as the white snow disappeared from the clearing, showing the dark dirt road that led down to the valley town, Hazel felt a quiet worry growing in her mind. The road was opening up again, which meant her time at the cabin might be coming to an end. On the 4th morning, she saw Cade hitching his 2 horses to the large wooden wagon. Her heart sank as she watched him work from the small window. She assumed that since her fever was gone and the trail was clear, he was preparing to take her back down to the town of Pine Ridge so she could leave on the next stagecoach. She turned away from the glass, her hands shaking slightly as she looked down at her clothes. Her old dress was still ruined, and she was still wearing his large red flannel shirt and her stiff leather boots. She had nothing else to take with her. The heavy front door opened, and Cade walked into the cabin, his large frame filling the entryway. He did not take off his black coat. He stood near the door and stated that the horses were ready for the road. Hazel held the back of the wooden rocking chair to keep herself steady, refusing to show her sadness. She forced a polite smile and asked him how much money she owed him for the food, the shelter, and the medicine he had given her while she was sick. Cade looked at her for a moment, noticing the way she held her shoulders straight. He told her that the stagecoach would arrive in the town of Pine Ridge the following day at noon, and the road was clear enough for them to make the journey down before dark. He added that she could sleep at the land office for the night, as the worker there owed him a favor. Hazel gave a short nod, thanked him for his help, and reached for her old coat on the wooden peg. She expected him to step aside so she could walk out to the wagon. He remained planted firmly on the floorboards, blocking the doorway completely. He looked down at his boots, then looked back at her face, his expression appearing slightly uneasy for the first time since she had met him. He spoke in his deep voice, stating that while the stagecoach was running, he had not told her she had to get on it. Hazel stopped moving, her breath catching in her throat as she looked up at his pale face and stark white hair. He looked away toward the iron stove, explaining that he had lived alone in the high mountains for 6 years, and usually preferred the quiet, but he did not mind having her company in the cabin. It was a very simple admission, spoken without any poetic words or dramatic style. Hazel looked at him, reminding him that life up in the mountains was very hard and cold. Cade looked back into her eyes, stating that the winters were indeed long, and the work was heavy, with no fine clothes or city music. But he promised her that if she stayed, she would never be cold or hungry again, and no person would ever raise a hand against her in his home. He held out his large, pale hand between them, palm up, leaving the choice entirely to her. He told her she could take the open road back to the town, or she could choose to stay in the cabin and help him prepare dinner. Hazel looked at his scarred hand, thought of the dangerous world outside, and knew what she wanted. She let her old woolen coat drop to the floorboards with a soft sound. She did not cry or make a dramatic speech. She simply stepped forward and placed her small hand into the center of his large, cold palm. His fingers closed around hers with a firm, steady grip that felt completely solid. She smiled quietly, saying she would stay and learn how to manage the kitchen without breaking any more pans. A very small smile appeared on the corner of Cade's mouth, and he squeezed her hand gently before letting go. He turned back to the open door, called out to the yard to unhitch the horses from the wagon, and took off his heavy black coat, hanging it back on the wooden peg. He told her the stove was getting cold, and they needed to get the fire up because the dried beans took a long time to boil. Hazel walked over to the hearth, picked up the iron rod, and moved the red coals until the flames began to grow again, sending bright sparks up the chimney into the clear mountain sky. Sitting by the warm stove later that evening, watching the shadow of the tall pine trees lengthen across the floorboards, Hazel felt a deep sense of stillness settle into her mind. The dark memories of the crowded city and the fear that had driven her across the country seemed to fade into the background, losing their sharp edges against the solid reality of the log walls. She looked at Cade as he sat at the wooden table, his pale skin and white hair looking silver in the fading light, and realized that safety was not a place with iron locks and crowded streets, but a quiet understanding between two people who had both known the cold. The high mountains would always have their storms, and the winters would always bring a heavy snow that cut them off from the rest of the world. But she knew she did not fear the quiet anymore. She had found a place where her soft hands could learn to be strong, where the silence was a comfort rather than a danger, and where she could look toward the coming days without wanting to hide. As she stirred the boiling pot on the stove, listening to the regular sound of the wind through the high branches, she knew her long journey had ended right here in the hills, and she was content to let the future arrive one quiet day at a time.